Bringing Scottish Rite to the wilderness is what we're going to discuss tonight. By 1880, much of the United States had experienced between 150 and 200 years of civilization, with people living in cities with paved streets, highways, bridges, and many other conveniences of the modern world. Now, this did not hold true for Indian Territory, which comprised all of what we now know of as Oklahoma, except the Panhandle. This is the area labeled the wilderness in this talk tonight. Masonry, however, had made some beachheads in the wilderness by 1880. Following is a quick review. Prior to the Civil War, records indicate that 4 Blue Lodges were chartered by the Grand Lodge of Arkansas, and they were in operation at that time. But then the war years of 1861 to 65 came along and brought total destruction of all lodge buildings and records. And then by 9 years after the end of the war, or 1874, there were 6 lodges chartered and operating again. 3 of these 6 lodges joined together in 1874 to form the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory. 3 years later, in 1877, McAlester, though still a small village of approximately 200 inhabitants, was granted a charter as Masonic Lodge Number 9. In 1880, a dispensation was granted to a group of 23 Masons in McAlester for a capitular lodge. Now, the capitular lodge, if you're not familiar with York Rite, is the first section or the chapter in York Rite Masonry. And so the capitular lodge in York Rite is similar to what the LOP is in Scottish Rite. So in other words, they had already started a York Rite subdivision in McAlester in 1880. Keep in mind that Oklahoma Territory was not created until 1890, a year after the first land run of '89. I hope this has properly set the stage for the story of how the Scottish Rite arrived in this area. Before beginning the main storyline, let me give you a quick glimpse at the procedure used to establish Scottish Rite Masonry in an area that has had no previous activity in the higher degrees. A person is named Deputy of the Supreme Council for the geographic area in question. He then performs like a missionary who is introducing Christianity to the pagan world. He goes to a few believers, in this instance, influential Master Masons, and if they are agreeable, he communicates the 29 higher degrees to them, one-on-one. They are then 32nd degree Masons. These new 32nd degree Masons are then the nucleus used to go out and seek others. After about 20 members are assembled, the deputy, with the approval of the Supreme Council, grants a temporary charter for a Lodge of Perfection. And this Lodge of Perfection then performs the first 14 degrees. And then it's supposed to grow from there. That's the general procedure. Now, this is not an easy to do in a civilized world and very difficult to do in a frontier or wilderness setting like the Indian Territory of the 1880s. Okay, back to the story. In the early 1880s, say 83, 84, something like that, Grand Commander Albert Pike was quite familiar with this area. He commissioned a 33rd degree Mason from Kansas to serve as the deputy for Indian Territory. His name was Charles Spaulding. He found that educated Indians were few in number, and they were active, and those that were active in tribal affairs or their own business interests. Also, the white men who were Master Masons were not plentiful either, and most did not have time for another Masonic activity. So Spaulding was replaced in 1888 by Robert W. Hill, 32nd degree, who was actually a Christian missionary in his normal trade or work. Hill moved to Muskogee and made a great start by communicating the degrees to some very influential Masonic leaders, you'll recognize some of these names. Patrick Burney, past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory. Also, other past Grand Masters, I know you'll recognize these names: Joseph Murrah, Edmund Doyle, Leo Bennett, who was the main Indian agent for the Choctaws, and then Robert Owens, who later became a longtime U.S. Senator from Oklahoma. Now, this was quite a strong lineup. So the next step was to issue letters temporary for a Lodge of Perfection, which was designated Albert Pike Lodge of Perfection number 1, located at Muskogee. Where have we heard that name before? Keep in mind, this was 1889, long before Guthrie or McAlester. As a result of his apparent success, Deputy Hill was one of the few men to receive both his KCCH and 33rd degree at the same time during the 1890 session of the Supreme Council. Now, that can't happen anymore because they've legislated that there's a time period. But anyway, after all of this, the idea of the higher degrees in Muskogee never took off. They never progressed beyond the Lodge of Perfection. Their membership dropped off, and eventually they faded out of the picture. Due to the pressure of frontier life, Muskogee missed out on the opportunity to become the Masonic Mecca in this new land. By 1896, a few years later, there were 2 locations where interest was being shown in attempting this seemingly impossible task of starting Scottish Rite. One was Chickasha, which was located on the western edge of the Chickasaw Nation, still in Indian Territory, and Guthrie, which had sprung up as a city in the newly formed Oklahoma Territory during and after the land run of '89. Deputy Hill granted letters temporary for the organization of the Alpha Lodge of Perfection at Chickasha. So by 1896, this membership was up to 20. So that's pretty good. The Alpha Lodge of Perfection might well have become the center of Scottish Rite Masonry in Oklahoma, except for 2 reasons. First, they, like Muskogee, struggled to increase in membership. 2, and most importantly, there was a man who journeyed to Guthrie by train on the first day of the land run. He possessed a remarkable zeal and ability to inspire men to accomplish what is often impractical. He had great leadership, which enabled him to inspire his followers to accomplish the impossible. His name was Harper S. Cunningham. Let's take a look at this new arrival in the Scottish Rite drama of Oklahoma. Cunningham hailed from Kansas. He became a Master Mason in 1871, but did not receive his Scottish Rite degrees until 1887. However, immediately recognizing his leadership qualities, he was quickly elected a KCCH in 1888. As mentioned, he arrived in Guthrie in '89, and the next year, 1890, he received both his 33rd degree and his commission as deputy of the Supreme Council for this new territory of Oklahoma, directly from Albert Pike. Now, Pike died in the next year in 1891, but the last 2 years that he was living, he and his staff were not always on the same page, and Cunningham's commission as deputy was never officially recorded. There was a period of time when both Robert Hill and Cunningham thought that each was fulfilling the job as deputy, so there was some overlap there. By 1893, finally, this situation was corrected, and Cunningham was placed over Oklahoma Territory and Hill over Indian Territory. A few years later, when Hill resigned and Edmund Doyle replaced Hill in Indian Territory. Guthrie is the center of attention in this next chapter of this story. Deputy Cunningham announced to a Masonic gathering in 1895 in Guthrie that he was getting ready to establish a Lodge of Perfection somewhere in Oklahoma Territory, and expressed hope that the Brethren of Guthrie would grasp this opportunity. Well, the response was instantaneous, as the Guthrie Masons knew full well that unless they acted quickly and energetically, Oklahoma City would be the logical home for the Rite in the territory, as the rivalry between these two cities had already begun. So by the next year of 1896, they were in a position to receive a temporary charter for a Lodge of Perfection, just like Chickasha had. Unlike their two predecessors, however, with Cunningham's leadership, they expanded rapidly. By 1898, they were granted a temporary Rose-Croix chapter. A year later, 1899, temporary Council of Kadash and Consistory charters were granted. Permanent charters are not granted until a permanent building is made available, so this was their next goal. Following is a sequence of events toward this goal. On May the 18th, 1899, a building association corporation was formed for the purpose of borrowing money and owning real estate. Thereafter, 3 lots were purchased in the downtown Guthrie, and an architect was hired. Plans for a sizable building were drawn up, which included a stage and auditorium with appropriate Masonic scenery. Now, this was risky, as theatrical degree presentation was still in limbo in the southern jurisdiction. However, Cunningham was one of the first strong proponents for theater. The cornerstone was laid in October of 1899 in this their downtown temple. That same year, Cunningham advanced from deputy to SGIG of Oklahoma Territory. By May of 1900, the building was completed. Permanent charters were received for all 4 bodies, and the first reunion was held in the new building. An amazing sequence of events. As you will recall, the corporation was formed only 12 months previous. So in all this period of time, in 1 year's time, all of this was accomplished, and they were able to stage their first successful full reunion with permanent charters. So Guthrie became the first successful Scottish Rite venture in the wilderness, at least to progress to full-scale consistory. Back to McAlester. Just before Edmund Doyle left the position of deputy for Indian Territory in 1901, he instituted a Lodge of Perfection in his home city of McAlester. The name of that lodge was Albert Pike Lodge of Perfection number 2. This name was able to be used because by this time the Muskogee LOP was defunct and not operating anymore. Now, to me, I think this was Edmund Doyle was getting ready to go out of office, and he knew it. And to me, I think this was probably just a nice gesture. He said, I'll give the people in McAlester an opportunity to see if they give this thing an opportunity to run with it. So this is what it took. Shortly thereafter, Cunningham was named SGIG of both territories after Edmund Doyle had resigned. McAlester so was the 3rd attempt after Muskogee and Chickasha to create a Scottish Rite presence in Indian Territory. McAllister's first class consisted of 23 candidates. Now, this was an appropriate number, as Guthrie's first class was only 18. By the way, I have a picture of the first class over here in this pictures if you'd like to look at it afterwards. The degree was done in the lodge room of South McAlester number 81, which was located on the 3rd floor of the Levy building on Choctaw, and was handled by then SGIG Cunningham. We have a copy of a picture of this first class, that's what I was mentioning, taken at the Katy Eating Place of the MKT Railroad. Now, this is before construction of the Union Depot that we used to remember, so the depot that preceded that, had an eating place in it, which was well recognized as probably the best place to eat in town. So that's where this picture was taken. You can look at it afterwards. Some recognizable names that were in that first class were Frank Craig, William H. Fuller, and William Perry Freeman. McAlester Lodge of Perfection had the same problems as the previous Indian Territory experiments. All members were not from McAlester, and because of transportation limitations, weather problems, and just the plain fast pace of frontier life, regular meetings and activities were difficult to schedule. Some of the new members, like Freeman and Craig, went to Guthrie for their further degree work during these years. So from 1901 to 1903, 2 years there, the second Albert Pike Lodge of Perfection was in jeopardy. In 1903, a new thing happened. A new person arrived. A true Superman arrived on the scene. His name, William Busby. Let's check out this new arrival. Prior to 1903, William Busby was an influential resident of Parsons, Kansas. He was mayor of the city of Parsons, already a 33rd degree Mason. He lived in Parsons, but he spent a lot of time in the late 1890s in McAlester as a coal sales representative for the Choctaw, Oklahoma and Gulf Railroad. So he was in and out of McAlester during those years. Before long, he became involved in not only sales, but in mine ownership and coal production. And it was then that he concluded his future was in McAlester. He built a mansion over in 4th Ward, and when it was completed, he and his family moved to McAlester as permanent citizens. Now this was 1903. Busby's arrival brought on a 10-year period of community growth never seen before or since in McAlester. Dr. Thurman Schuler, a historian of quite good stature in the past years, wrote a biography of this era, and he called it McAllister's Golden Age. And it was primarily because of this one guy named Busby. Okay, SGIG Carper Cunningham was disappointed in McAllister's progress in the Scottish Rite. Like I said, 2 years with hardly any action. When Busby arrived in McAlester, Cunningham seized the opportunity to jumpstart this struggling LOP. You've heard the story, which is strictly rumor, but probably true, that Cunningham tells Busby, "If you'll get Scottish Rite started in Indian Territory, I will make you my deputy, and then you will succeed me when I leave." We don't know whether that's true or not, but that's exactly what happened. From previous talks, you know what happened, but let me summarize this period, which could be labeled AB, after Busby. Within 6 months after Busby's arrival, and that would be in 1904, a frame building called the Tabernacle was constructed on Washington Avenue. This came about because Busby gathered a gang of 6. He each signed a note, including Busby himself, for $1,000, which gave the funds to build and equip the tabernacle. These 6 were Frank Craig, Daniel M. Haley, James Elliott, Ed Ferris, Lewis Lounsbury, and Perry Freeman. The building was 25 foot wide and 84 foot long with a half basement. You've seen pictures of it, I know. I've got one over here. This was it wasn't a thing of beauty, that's for sure. And they named it the Tabernacle as they could not call it a temple, as they had a real temple in their long-range plans. So the building was completed, the frame building was completed in 1904, and thereafter charters temporary were granted, and the first full reunion where all 29 degrees were presented to a class of 96 men, really great, 96 men who comprised what was named the Alpha class. in the tabernacle. This took place in February of 1905. Have a picture then of the Alpha class right over here. So the tabernacle served its purpose very well. I've just run on to some pictures of the interior. We've seen outside pictures of the tabernacle for a long time, but I've never seen a picture of the interior. Well, I've got one right over here now if you might want to take a look at it. And then there's some more that are up in the museum, up in the outside the auditorium lobby there. But and that's the ones that show the stage and the costumes. But anyway, I know that the frame building and property probably did not cost over $3,000 back in 1904 dollars. Now I see where the rest went for stage props, scenery, and costumes. I was really surprised at the quality of the costumes that I saw in those pictures that are up in our museum. They were great. So you can see where they spent the rest of the money. 7 reunions were held in this wood frame tabernacle from 1904 to 1906, 7 of them. And in the spring of 1907, when the first real temple was completed, the tabernacle had produced 636 members, of which 121 were from McAlester. And if you'll recall, that was a reunion that we talked about the last time that I have a program from that 1907 reunion, which was the dedication of the new building, the new red brick building, and the Grand Commander was in attendance. So it was really a big deal. I won't go into any amount of detail on the building of the red brick temple, as I've done a previous talk on that. But to complete the story, allow me to remind you of a few points in that regard. Before the tabernacle was completed, a committee had already been set up to plan and build the real temple. You can guess who was the chairman. Busby, of course. He and Daniel Haley decided that the new temple should be located in a commanding location, like the highest elevation in South McAlester. So without consulting the committee, these two men went to the property owner of the person whose residence located on the corner of 2nd and Adams, who happened to be, in person, Edmund Doyle. He's the one that had the residence located at this address. Now, he didn't want to sell the house. He was happy with it. Everything was going good. But these two men were evidently very persuasive. And so the longtime mason finally gave in. And his house and property, which is a 150 by 150 foot lot, of course we've had to add on to that through the years, but that's what it started with, was purchased for $5,000, and Busby and Haley split the cost of this. From that point on, Busby hired the architect, actually served as contractor for the construction of the building. 15 months later, the red brick temple was dedicated at this reunion we spoke about, the April reunion of 1907, with the Sovereign Grand Commander in attendance. 7 months later, in 1907, statehood arrived, uniting both territories into the state of Oklahoma, the 46th state in the Union. So this new era of Scottish Rite Masonry in McAlester and the new state began at the same time. In closing, I refer you to the old historical maxim: how can you chart the future if you don't know the past? The lesson I've learned from working on this presentation or history is that the key to any problem is leadership. The person standing at the helm, navigating his ship through uncharted seas and unexpected storms, is the necessary ingredient. In this story, Guthrie and McAlester had many hard-working and faithful members. No doubt about it. This couldn't have happened without those faithful members. But it was Cunningham and Busby who made the difference in Guthrie and McAlester. This ends what I thought was an interesting story of how Scottish Rite was brought to the wilderness. Thank you.